The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window of Morgan's farmhouse as she sipped her coffee and watched the weather app on her phone. 73 degrees. Perfect. She'd planned this morning meticulously, a 5-mile run that would take her through the winding mountain roads leading to the county park trail. The scenic route. The one that made her feel like she was in a yoga retreat commercial even though she was basically gasping and sweating through her designer sports bra. Her name was Victoria Chen, though everyone called her Vic. She was 34, divorced his loss, she'd tell you, and had recently moved to Millbrook, a small town nestled in the foothills 2 hours north of the city. She'd rented a converted barn apartment on the edge of town, paid premium price for rustic charm, and had immediately set about becoming the most notable person in a town of 2,000 people. New York lawyer turned wellness entrepreneur. Had a TikTok account with 47,000 followers where she posted about intentional living and authentic connection to nature. She was also spectacularly unpopular. The problem wasn't her ambition. Millbrook understood ambition. The problem wasn't even her New York accent or her habit of correcting people on their pronunciation of quinoa. The problem was simpler, more fundamental. Victoria Chen genuinely believed the world existed to accommodate her. She'd lived in Millbrook for exactly 4 months. The route she'd mapped out was perfect except for one thing, a 2-mile section that technically crossed private property. She'd noticed it on Google Maps, noted how the road curved around someone's land in an infuriating zigzag that added nearly 20 minutes to her run. The shortcut would cut right through the property, save her almost a mile, and put her back on County Road by the time she needed to turn toward the park. When she'd looked up the property records, she'd found out it belonged to Morgan Hayes, a woman in her early 50s who apparently raised alpacas. Alpacas. Not even real farming, just some hobby animal thing. The kind of person who probably didn't even lock her gates, Victoria had reasoned. The kind of person who wouldn't notice or care if someone cut through. That was the thing about Victoria that her 47,000 followers would never understand from her carefully curated Instagram posts. She wasn't just ambitious. She was entitled in a way that went deeper than privilege. She'd grown up wealthy, sure, but plenty of wealthy people developed empathy. Victoria had never needed to. Every obstacle in her life had been solved by money, charm, or sheer determination to act as though the obstacle didn't exist. She texted her friend Lena from the city, just mapped out the perfect run here. Small town is finally growing on me, or maybe I'm just making it grow up to my standards, lol. Lena responded with a heart emoji and a laughing face. Lena was her only friend who still responded to her texts. Her ex-husband hadn't responded to anything in 2 years, and frankly, Victoria thought that was petty. She changed into her running outfit, black Lululemon leggings, a matching sports bra that showed off the abs she spent 40 minutes a day maintaining, white AirPods, and an Apple Watch that cost more than most people's car payments. She pulled her dark hair into a high, tight ponytail that she'd learned, through practice, was the most flattering angle for her face. The morning was cool and crisp, perfect. Her apartment was at mile marker 5, and the Hayes property started right around mile marker 3. She'd already scoped it out once when she was exploring the area, driving slowly past with her windows down, looking. The fence was simple chain link, the kind you could see through. The gate was a utilitarian thing, probably older than she was. There was a property sign, HAYES Alpaca Farm, no trespassing. Victoria had rolled her eyes at that too, the kind of woman who thought a sign would stop her. She started running at 6:47 a.m. just as the sun was turning the sky pink and gold. The first 2 miles were gorgeous, she'd give the town that. The roads were quiet, lined with birch and oak, and the air smelled like fresh earth and possibility. She took a selfie at mile 1, made sure to get the sunrise and her face both glowing. She'd post it later with some caption about honoring my body or being present to the moment. By mile 3, she was ready for a shortcut. The Hayes property was marked clearly. A mailbox with HAYES in peeling letters. The gate stood open, not locked, just pulled closed. Victoria glanced around. The road was empty. She'd come this way at 6:47 a.m. on a Saturday specifically because she knew it would be. She'd researched when country people woke up. She'd known Morgan Hayes would still be asleep. She reached down, pushed the gate open, and stepped through. The property was larger than she'd expected, stretching back at least a quarter mile before the trees took over. There was a large red barn to her left, painted with fatting white trim. To the right, more structures, a shed, what looked like a small greenhouse, some kind of shelter. And beyond, enclosed in sturdy fencing of their own, several shapes. Animals. Even from this distance, she could make out the distinctive silhouette of alpacas, their long necks and fluffy heads unmistakable. They didn't matter. She wasn't here long enough for them to matter. Victoria kept running, her pace steady and controlled, her breathing measured. She trained for this exact kind of distance. The ground beneath her feet was a mix of dried grass and dirt, not perfect, but fine. She could see where the property line would end, where the fence along the far edge would meet the county road. Another quarter mile, maybe less. She was slightly more than halfway across when she heard the sound. It was low at first, almost a hum, a vibration in the air. She'd turned up her music, so at first she thought it was just the bass from her pump-up playlist. She exclusively listened to aggressive remixes of pop songs. But then she pulled out an earbud and heard it clearly. A voice, a woman's voice, coming from the direction of the barn, yelling something. Victoria didn't stop running, but she glanced back. There was a woman standing on the porch of the barn. Older, probably in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a messy bun. She was wearing overalls and work boots, and she was absolutely, unmistakably yelling at Victoria. Hey, stop. Victoria kept running. She turned up her music again. She was almost to the property line, maybe 30 seconds away from the county road. Another 30 seconds and she'd be gone, and what was this woman going to do? Call the cops about a trespasser who was already leaving. That was the moment she heard something else. A gate opening, metal on metal, a familiar squeaking sound. And then the sound of hooves, no, not hooves, softer than that. A strange, urgent padding sound multiplied, many of them getting closer. Victoria risked another glance behind her. 3 alpacas were running directly at her, at a speed that seemed impossible for animals with such long, delicate-looking legs. Their ears were flat back against their heads. Their eyes were fixed on her with a focus and intensity that made something primitive in Victoria's brain suddenly, violently engage. She stopped looking back and ran harder. The county road wasn't as close as she'd thought. She'd misjudged the distance, or maybe adrenaline was warping her perception. The ground seemed to stretch out in front of her, endless. The padding sounds behind her were getting closer. She could hear the woman from the barn still yelling, could hear her now yelling something that sounded like, "Don't run, stop running." But Victoria had never stopped running from anything in her life. Not when her first marriage fell apart. Not when her law firm asked her to leave. Not when she had to rebuild herself from scratch in a tiny town where nobody knew her name. Running was what you did when things got uncomfortable. Running was power. The county road materialized in front of her like salvation. Just ahead, maybe 10 more yards. She could see the asphalt, the painted line, safety. She was going to make it. Her shoe caught on something. A root, a divot in the ground, her own desperation. She went down hard, her hands hitting the ground first, the impact jarring through her wrists and arms. She felt the burn of friction, dirt and small stones embedding in her palms. She tried to roll, tried to get up, but there was a moment of fumbled desperation where her body wasn't responding fast enough. The alpacas stopped short, surrounding her at a cautious distance, but the message was clear. The lead one, the largest, with cream-colored fur and a dark face, was breathing hard, its eyes locked on hers. And then Morgan Hayes was there, slightly out of breath herself, holding a lead rope. "I told you to stop running," she said, not unkindly, but with the tone of someone who was stating a simple fact. "They chase runners, always have. Something about the motion triggers their prey instinct, I think, or maybe they just think it's fun." She shook her head, slightly amused. "Your name better be Trespasser, because that's the only introduction you're getting before we talk about how you cut through my fence." Victoria was breathing hard, her palms bleeding, dirt under her perfect manicure. The alpacas were still watching her, and she realized with absolute clarity that these animals could hurt her seriously if they wanted to. She also realized, in that same moment of horrible clarity, that nobody knew she was here. That she'd chosen this route specifically because it was empty. That she'd cut through someone's property specifically because she'd calculated they wouldn't care or wouldn't notice. Morgan helped Victoria up with the kind of casual strength that spoke of years of manual labor. Her grip was firm, her hands rough with calluses. She guided Victoria over to the nearby fence and helped her sit on the lowest rail, then retrieved a small first aid kit from the barn. "Don't worry," Morgan said, cleaning Victoria's palms with efficient, no-nonsense movements. "They won't touch you now that I'm here. Alpacas are actually pretty docile once they understand you're not a threat, but a runner. To them, a runner is basically a moving target." Victoria was trying to slow her breathing, trying to regain her composure. Her wrists ached. Her palms were screaming. Beneath her carefully maintained exterior, something was starting to crack. "I was just taking a shortcut," Victoria said, and even to her own ears it sounded defensive. "It's not like I was stealing anything." Morgan paused in her cleaning. She looked at Victoria over the top of her glasses. She'd gone back inside to get them, small wire-rimmed things that made her look professorial. And there was something in that look that made Victoria feel approximately 8 years old. "You cut through my fence," Morgan said slowly, as if explaining something to someone who didn't speak English. "With scissors, from what I can tell. You made a hole large enough for a human to fit through, which, if one of my animals had been panicked or curious, could have gotten out, could have been hit on the county road, could have been stolen. You crossed my property without permission, and when I told you to stop, you ran." She wrapped gauze around Victoria's left hand with practiced care. "That's not a shortcut, honey. That's theft of services and trespassing." Victoria's jaw tightened. She wanted to argue. She wanted to explain that she was important, that she had followers, that her time was valuable, that Morgan was being petty and dramatic. She wanted to explain that she'd moved to this town, that she was building something here, that a little country woman with alpacas shouldn't have the power to make her feel this way. Instead, she felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, and she hated herself for it. "I'll pay for the fence," Victoria said quietly. "How much? I can get you a check today." Morgan finished with the second hand and sat back, studying Victoria with an expression that was difficult to read. It wasn't angry. If anything, it looked a little sad. "That's not really the point," Morgan said. "The point is that you thought you had the right to cut through my property because you decided that your time was more important than my boundaries. The point is that when I asked you to stop, you didn't respect that either. The point is that you're willing to endanger my animals and potentially break your own neck because you couldn't be bothered to take a longer route." She stood, putting the first aid kit back in the barn. "The fence will cost about $800 to replace. The section you cut is beyond repair, but I'm not going to charge you for it." Morgan turned back, and Victoria saw something in her face that looked like disappointment. "I'm going to let you go, and you're going to think about why what you did was wrong, and maybe, you'll learn something." Victoria felt heat rise in her chest. That was somehow worse than being punished. That was being judged and found wanting. "I don't need a lecture," Victoria said, standing too. "I said I'd pay for it." "I know what you said." Morgan moved toward the alpacas, who were still watching with interest. "And I believe you will, because you're not a bad person, Victoria. You're just someone who's never had to think about how her choices affect other people. You've never had to sit with the discomfort of doing something wrong and facing consequences, so you buy your way out instead." The use of her name, Morgan knew her name, was somehow the worst part of all. "How do you?" "Small town," Morgan said simply. "You're the New York yoga lady. Everyone knows about you." She clipped the alpacas back into their pen with a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to the firmness she'd shown Victoria. "There's nothing wrong with wanting to improve yourself, but improving yourself means looking at the ways you make the world worse for other people. It means changing, not just paying a fine." Victoria wanted to leave. She wanted to turn and run the rest of the way to the county road and finish her workout and pretend this had never happened. But something in the way Morgan was looking at her, like she actually cared about what Victoria became, made her stay, even though every instinct was screaming at her to escape. "I didn't think anyone would notice," Victoria said. "It came out small." "That's the problem," Morgan replied. "You didn't think about it at all, that's what I'm saying." The alpacas pressed against their fence, and Morgan moved along the railing, checking their water. She worked with the kind of intentional care that spoke of years of routine, of genuine concern for these animals' well-being. Victoria realized, watching her, that Morgan loved these alpacas, that they weren't a hobby or a TikTok opportunity or a way to seem interesting. They were genuinely beloved. It was humbling in a way that nothing in Victoria's adult life had prepared her for. "I'll pay for the fence," Victoria said again, but this time her voice was different, smaller, more real, "and I won't run that route again." Morgan turned, and there was the faintest suggestion of approval in her expression. "That's a start." The next week was brutal in ways Victoria hadn't anticipated. She wired $800 to Morgan's account. Morgan had given her the information without commentary, and then she had to face the social consequences of her actions. Word had gotten around. Of course it had. Millbrook was a town where everyone knew everyone's business, and the image of the fancy New York lady getting chased by alpacas while trespassing was apparently irresistible. The barista at the local coffee shop gave her a knowing smile. The woman at the grocery store asked, loudly enough for others to hear, whether Victoria had learned to respect property lines yet. An article in the local newspaper, "Fence Cutting Incident at Hayes Alpaca Farm," made her look like a criminal. But the worst part was that she'd started to see herself the way Morgan had described, as someone who'd been operating in the world without thinking about its impact. She'd moved to Millbrook, yes, but she'd moved here to save herself, not to become part of the community. She'd positioned herself as above these people, slower, less ambitious, less worth listening to. She'd made a decision to cut through Morgan's property not because she was evil, but because she'd literally not considered that Morgan's boundaries mattered as much as her own convenience. 10 days after the incident, Victoria found herself standing at Morgan's gate again. She dressed down, jeans instead of designer leggings, a regular t-shirt instead of activewear. She'd even put her hair down, let it fall naturally around her shoulders. She looked like a regular person. She felt like one too, which was terrifying and oddly liberating. Morgan was in the field with the alpacas, brushing one's coat. She looked up when she heard the gate close, recognition flickering across her face. "I came to apologize," Victoria said, "properly not just by paying you money, but I came to actually apologize." Morgan set down her brush and moved toward the fence. This close, Victoria could see that her eyes were a striking gray-green, the kind of eyes that probably saw things very clearly. "I'm listening," Morgan said. "When I cut through your fence, I didn't think about you at all," Victoria began, and the honesty of it was shocking. "I thought about my route and my time and my comfort. I calculated that you wouldn't notice or wouldn't care. I never once thought about what I could be taking from you, your sense of safety on your own property, the risk to your animals, the fact that I was literally breaking your stuff because it was easier for me." She took a breath. "I'm sorry for that, for all of that. And for not stopping when you told me to, for running instead of facing what I'd done." Morgan watched her in silence for a long moment. "Okay," she said finally. "That actually sounds like you mean it." "I do," Victoria said. I'm working on being better. I moved to this town and treated it like it was supposed to change for me instead of thinking about how I could actually be part of the community. I thought I was above the normal rules because I had money or followers or whatever. But you were right. That doesn't make me a good person. That makes me the opposite." Morgan was quiet again. Then she moved to the gate and unlatched it. "Come here," she said. "I want to introduce you properly to the alpacas, not as threats or obstacles, but as what they actually are." The lead alpaca was named Senator. Not for any political reasons, Morgan explained, but because he'd arrived at the farm with that name and it had stuck. He was 8 years old, a breeding male, and according to Morgan, smarter than most people. "Don't take that personally," Morgan added as Victoria stood nervously near the fence. "I say that about most people." Senator was examining Victoria with what she could only describe as skepticism. His dark face and long eyelashes gave him an almost judgmental expression, like he was weighing whether she was worth his time. "Alpacas are prey animals," Morgan explained, moving beside Victoria with easy confidence. "In the wild, they'd run from threats. What happened when you ran was that it triggered his chasing instinct. It's not that he wanted to hurt you. It's that your running looked exactly like prey behavior. He was doing what comes naturally." She showed Victoria how to hold out her hand, palm flat. "Let him smell you. Alpacas understand a lot more than people give them credit for. They remember, and they hold grudges." Victoria, heart still racing slightly, extended her hand. Senator sniffed it with surprising delicacy, his whiskers tickling her palm. His breath was warm and smelled faintly of hay. After a moment, he licked her hand once and turned away, apparently satisfied that she was acceptable. "He forgave you," Morgan said. "That's his way of saying it." They spent the next 3 hours working in the pasture. Morgan had chores to do. The alpacas needed fresh water, the shelter needed cleaning, their feed needed adjusting. Victoria, in her regular clothes and without her phone, she'd left it in Morgan's farmhouse, a deliberate choice, helped. It was work that her New York personal trainer would have deemed inefficient, but it was work that felt good in a way that her carefully designed gym routine had never quite managed. The second alpaca was named Princess, and she was, according to Morgan, a character. She was smaller than Senator, with cream-colored fleece and a distinctly ornery personality. She would have been perfectly at home on Victoria's Instagram, objectively cute, performatively sweet. But she was also the one who liked to steal tools and hide them, who had a habit of spitting at people she didn't like, and who'd apparently once eaten an entire flower arrangement that someone had brought to the farm as a gift. People want alpacas to be cute accessories, Morgan said, handing Victoria a bin of feed. They see them online and think they're just fluffy versions of sheep or something, but they're their own animals. They have personalities, they have preferences, they deserve respect. The third was Captain, an older male with dark gray fleece that was showing silver around his face. He was the calmest of the three, moving with the slow deliberation of an animal who'd learned that patience got you what you needed. Captain is what happens when alpacas grow wise, Morgan said, watching him eat from the trough with obvious affection. He's 17. Got maybe another 5 good years in him if we're lucky. Every day with him is a gift. As the afternoon moved toward evening, Morgan made sandwiches in her kitchen, a simple place with mismatched furniture and walls lined with photos of alpacas at various ages. Victoria sat at the table and watched her work, and something about the domesticity of it, the normality, was startling. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria said. Morgan turned, waiting. "Why are you being nice to me? I cut through your property. I endangered your animals. By all rights, you should hate me or at least be way less forgiving." Morgan considered this while she sliced tomatoes with efficient movements. "Because," she said finally, "I was someone like you once. Not exactly, my failures looked different. I was a corporate accountant in Boston. I had a fancy apartment and a fancy car, and I was very important at parties. And then I had a breakdown." She set the knife down and turned to face Victoria fully. "Not the metaphorical kind, the real kind, where one day I couldn't get out of bed and the next day I couldn't remember why I'd ever wanted to. Took me 5 years to figure out that I'd optimized my whole life for external validation. I was constantly proving something to people who didn't care about me." She went back to making sandwiches. "I moved to Millbrook to save my life," Morgan continued. "Got these alpacas because I needed something to care for that wouldn't judge my bank account. Opened this farm because I needed to do something with my hands, something real. And you know what I learned? That a simple life where you actually know your neighbors and your animals and you do work that has immediate, visible results, that's not a step down. That's freedom." Victoria felt something catch in her throat. "I moved here for those reasons too," Victoria said quietly. "Not consciously, but yeah, my marriage fell apart. My law firm asked me to leave because I was having anxiety attacks at depositions. I rebuilt my whole image and people liked that version better. The wellness coach version, the girl with good lighting and good affirmations, but none of it felt real." Morgan slid a plate across the table. "Then maybe the alpacas did you a favor. Maybe you needed to be knocked down a peg to remember that you're human." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the farm, the soft calls of the alpacas, the wind moving through the fields, the absolutely ordinary sounds of a place where people and animals lived together. "What if I wanted to volunteer here?" Victoria asked eventually. "I mean, I'd pay for the fence, obviously, but what if I wanted to actually help, learn more?" Morgan looked at her over her sandwich, and Victoria saw something shift in her expression. Possibility, maybe. The idea that this prickly New York woman might actually have a desire to change. "Then you could come twice a week," Morgan said. "Tuesday and Saturday mornings. We'd start you with basic animal care, work up from there. And you'd have to turn off your phone. No photos, no documentation, no performance. You'd just be here doing the work." "Okay," Victoria said. "Yeah, I can do that." And Morgan added, "You'd probably make some friends. This place gets people. Other people who needed to reset their lives. We run a kind of informal community here. Saturday mornings, we usually have at least one other volunteer. It's not glamorous, but it's real." Victoria thought about her 47,000 followers. She thought about how many of them would unfollow her if she stopped posting content. She thought about Lena, who hadn't responded to her messages in 2 weeks. She thought about how many conversations she'd had in the last 6 months where she felt like she was playing a role. "I like real," she said finally. "I think I've been doing everything except real for the first Tuesday Victoria showed up to volunteer. She wore clothes that were neither athletic nor fashionable, just practical. Jeans with actual holes in them from work, not design. An old sweatshirt she found in Morgan's donation box. Actual boots, mud-ready. She left her phone in her car and locked the doors. Morgan raised an eyebrow when she saw her but didn't comment, just handed her a pair of work gloves that had clearly belonged to many hands before hers. They started with the difficult work, mucking out the shelters. It was physically demanding, unglamorous, and absolutely necessary. Victoria learned that alpacas, for all their beauty, were prolific poopers, and that their waste needed to be cleared daily to maintain healthy living conditions. She learned the proper techniques for managing the hay, for checking the animal's hooves, for noting any signs of illness or distress. She also learned that when you worked with animals instead of for an Instagram algorithm, your brain operated differently. There was no room for anxiety about how you looked, no mental commentary about whether you were doing things optimally. There was just the work, and its rewards, and the immediate feedback from four-legged creatures who didn't care about your follower count. By the third week, her palms had developed calluses to match Morgan's. By the sixth week, she could tell the difference between Senator's low rumble, which meant contentment, and Princess's different low rumble, which meant she was about to spit at someone. By the third month, she'd become part of something that looked, from the outside, like a simple alpaca farm but felt, from the inside, like a refuge. The Saturday morning community was small but fierce. There was David, a former real estate developer who'd had an affair, blown up his marriage, and apparently needed to spend his time with animals who didn't judge him. There was Lisa, who'd been a theater actress and had a panic disorder so severe that the only place she could breathe was around animals. There was Marcus, just retired from the Navy, who needed something to do with his hands and his PTSD. And there was Tom, a local farmer, who just loved animals and thought the whole community aspect was charming. They didn't really talk about their pasts. That was one of the unwritten rules. You came to the farm, you did the work, you were present with the animals and each other, and that was enough. Morgan had somehow created a place where healing happened without people having to perform their trauma or their recovery. By the fourth month, Victoria had stopped checking her Instagram. She'd realized one day that she hadn't looked at her follower count in 3 weeks, and instead of panicking, she'd felt relief. The turning point came on a Saturday morning in late September. Victoria was brushing Captain, something she'd gotten very good at. The old alpaca leaned into her touches the way a dog might, and she was thinking about how simple it was to be valued for what you did rather than who you were, when Morgan appeared with a camera. "I want to take some pictures," Morgan said. "For the farm's website, we're expanding, trying to offer some educational tour. I need some good photos of people working with the animals." Victoria's first instinct was excitement. Oh, she could make these photos aesthetic, she could get good lighting, she could probably get her makeup done first. But she stopped herself. She was wearing unwashed clothes, and her hair was in a messy bun, and her nails were literally dirt under them because she'd been working in the garden. "Okay," she said simply. "Let me know what you need." Morgan took pictures as Victoria worked. No posing, no artificial moments, just Victoria being present with Captain. At one point, the alpaca turned and pressed his nose against her shoulder, and Morgan caught that moment, and Victoria could see in her eyes that she'd gotten something good. "Can I show you?" Morgan asked. Victoria looked at the photos, and she barely recognized herself. There was someone in those images who looked peaceful. Actual peaceful, not Instagram peaceful with a carefully arranged life in the background. Just peaceful. "These are really good," Victoria said. "You should use them." "I'm going to," Morgan replied. "I'm also going to give you copies. You should see yourself when you're not performing." That evening, Victoria sat in her apartment, which she still had, though she'd stopped paying the premium for authentic rustic charm and had redecorated it in a way that made her happy rather than in a way she thought would impress others. And she opened her Instagram. She hadn't posted in months. She had a message request from someone she'd worked with at her law firm, asking if she was okay because she'd disappeared from social media. She didn't respond. Instead, she pulled up one of the photos Morgan had taken. Victoria in work clothes, Captain's nose against her shoulder, genuine peace on her face. No filters, no hashtags, no performance. She posted it with a simple caption, "Learning what matters." She lost 3,000 followers in the first week. People who'd been following for the wellness inspiration and authentic New York energy moved on to fresher content. And Victoria realized that she didn't care. The people following her now were different. They were people who'd seen something real and responded to it. They were fewer, but they felt more substantial. The real shock came in November, when Victoria's ex-husband called her for the first time in 2 years. "I saw your recent posts," James said without preamble. You seem different. Victoria sat down on her couch, bemused. James had never called her to chat, even when they were married. I am different. I moved to a small town and started doing actual work instead of performing as a person. It looks good on you, he said. I mean, I don't know you anymore, apparently, but from the photos it looks good. After they hung up, a brief, awkward call that neither of them quite knew how to handle, Victoria thought about how little his opinion mattered to her now. Once his approval had been currency. Now it was just a call from someone she'd once loved who didn't know her anymore. And that was fine, that was more than fine, that was freedom. By December, Victoria had been volunteered by Morgan to help teach the educational tour. Children came to learn about alpacas, and Victoria found that she was genuinely good at explaining animal behavior and care to young minds. She found that she cared whether they learned properly, whether they treated the animals with respect. She found that her need to perform had been replaced by a need to be useful. One evening, after a particularly long tour day, Morgan asked her to stay for dinner. There was a fire in the small fireplace in the living room, and they sat in mismatched chairs with glasses of wine, listening to the quiet of the farm settling around them. I have a proposition, Morgan said. The farm is growing. We're getting more volunteers, more tour, more community interest. I need help managing all of that. Someone who knows business, who understands marketing but doesn't need to make everything into a personal brand. Someone who wants to help this place succeed. She paused, watching Victoria's face. I'm offering you a job, part-time to start full-time whenever you're ready, running the administrative side of the farm while I focus on the animals. It won't pay as much as you probably made in the city. It won't be impressive at parties, but it's real work with real purpose. Victoria felt something catch in her throat, a job offer, from someone who'd known her at her absolute worst, someone who'd chosen to believe that she could change. Yes, she said, absolutely yes. Even though it means leaving your apartment and probably eventually moving to one of the cottages I own, becoming even more embedded in this small town, giving up on the Instagram persona entirely. Especially because of those things, Victoria said. Morgan smiled, and it was the first time Victoria had seen her smile with complete, uncomplicated warmth. 6 months into her new job, Victoria was sitting in the Millbrook Community Center at a town council meeting. She was there representing the farm. They were trying to get funding for an expanded education program, and Morgan had pushed Victoria to make the pitch. The alpaca farm has become a community anchor, Victoria heard herself saying, and she was surprised by how comfortably the words came. We've helped 17 people in the last year who were struggling with mental health issues find a safe place to volunteer and connect. We've brought school groups, seniors, children with disabilities. We've created jobs for locals and established Millbrook as a destination for educational tourism. She clicked to the next slide. Photos of volunteers working, children learning, animals being cared for. What started as my mistake, trespassing on this property, has become the best thing that ever happened to me, and I'd like to help make it available to more people. The council voted unanimously to grant the funding. After the meeting, people approached Victoria to congratulate her, people from town, people who'd initially been cold to her, who'd made comments about the New York yoga lady. They were warm now. They called her by her name. They asked about the farm. And Victoria realized that she'd become part of this community not by impressing them, but by actually showing up and doing the work. By failing spectacularly and being willing to change. By choosing the difficult path of genuine growth over the easy path of external validation. The trouble started, innocuously enough, in June. Victoria was at the mailbox when she saw the vehicle pull into the property. It was a sleek black SUV, the kind that looked out of place on the rural property. A woman got out, someone Victoria recognized immediately from the countless profile pictures and articles about Manhattan real estate developers. It was Rachel Chen, her younger sister. Rachel hadn't spoken to Victoria in 3 years. Not since Victoria had left the law firm, and Rachel had assumed Victoria had become a failure. They came from the kind of family where ambition was currency, and anything less than constant upward momentum was a personal betrayal. Victoria, Rachel said, taking in her appearance with poorly concealed judgment. I barely recognized you. You look earthy. Victoria felt the old defensiveness rise, that old impulse to prove something, but she breathed through it. Hi, Rachel, this is a surprise. What are you doing here? I'm here on business, Rachel said. She pulled out her phone, and there was something in the gesture, that casual, performed ease, that Victoria recognized as herself from another life. I'm representing a developer who's very interested in this area. Property values are about to skyrocket. Millbrook is becoming the next Aspen, basically. We're looking to acquire several parcels to develop into a resort and equestrian center. Victoria felt something cold settle in her stomach. Okay, she said carefully, and Rachel said, scrolling through something on her phone, this property is perfect. Prime location already has infrastructure for animal care, substantial acreage. It's probably worth, conservatively, 3 times what it's worth on paper right now. Morgan could sell it, make an absolute fortune, retire to somewhere warm, and actually enjoy her life. Morgan enjoys her life here, Victoria said quietly. Rachel looked up from her phone, actually making eye contact for the first time. Does she? Or has she convinced herself that she enjoys it because the alternative, admitting that she's been wasting her potential on a rural hobby farm, is too painful to face? It was the exact thing Victoria would have said 3 years ago. The exact value system. The exact way of looking at the world, as something to be optimized, exploited, leveraged for maximum personal gain. I need to tell Morgan you're here, Victoria said. Of course, Rachel replied smoothly. In fact, I'd love to make a pitch to both of you. Victoria, you're smart. You know that the farm will never be more than it is right now. You know that real ambition means moving forward, not staying static. I could get you a job at the development company. Real money, real advancement, real impact. Think about it. Morgan listened to everything Rachel had to say with a calm that suggested she'd heard it before. When Rachel had finally left, still confident, still absolutely certain that she'd planted seeds of reasonable doubt, Morgan made tea, and they sat in the kitchen like they had that first day. She'll be back, Morgan said. People like that, they don't give up. They see potential and they see wasted opportunity and they can't let it go. I almost listened to her, Victoria admitted. For just a second, I thought about how much money we could have, what I could do with that money. What would you do with it? Morgan asked. Victoria thought about this carefully. A year ago, she would have had a list. Travel, a house in the city, investments, status. But now, when she tried to imagine what she'd actually want with unlimited resources, she came up empty. Or rather, she realized that she already had what she wanted. The farm, the community, the work that meant something. I have no idea, Victoria said. I think I already have what I want. Morgan nodded, unsurprised. Then we're going to have to deal with Rachel and her developer differently. Not by refusing, but by being very clear about what this place is and why we're not selling. Rachel's developer, a man named Preston who had the look of someone who'd never had a genuine need in his life, came to the farm twice over the next month. He was charming and very professional, and he showed up with detailed financial projections that were impossible to argue with on a purely mathematical level. The property would increase in value by $3 million within 5 years. Morgan could take that money and do whatever she wanted. The catch was that Millbrook would be transformed. The quiet roads would become commercial thoroughfares. The rural character would be replaced by vacation homes and resort infrastructure. The other small farms that had made up the community fabric would be slowly consumed by the inevitable creep of development. And the alpaca farm, once it served its purpose as a development landmark, would eventually be converted into something more profitable. Morgan listened to all of it, and then she said no. Preston was shocked. You understand, he said carefully, that this is a generational wealth opportunity, right? You're choosing to stay poor out of sentiment. I'm choosing to protect something, Morgan said calmly, because I know what happens when you sell your soul for money. You get the money, and then you spend the rest of your life wondering who you would have been if you'd kept your integrity. After Preston left, he sent a formal letter indicating that the developer would acquire the property through other means if necessary. There were complications with property rights and easements, but essentially, he was threatening her with lawyers and bureaucracy. It was Rachel who called Victoria, not Morgan. You need to talk to her, Rachel said without preamble. She's being insane. She has an opportunity to transform her life, and she's saying no because of animals. Because of what those animals represent, Victoria said. Community, healing, purpose. Those aren't small things, Rachel. Those are everything. You sound like you've been brainwashed, Rachel snapped. The Victoria I knew 3 years ago would never turn down this opportunity. The Victoria I was 3 years ago was miserable and didn't know it, Victoria replied. She built her whole life on the assumption that more was always better, more money, more status, more validation, and it made her isolated and anxious and hollow. I like being happy more than I like being ambitious. Well, that's convenient, Rachel said coldly, because you've managed to become both poor and happy. Congratulations on lowering your standards. She hung up. The legal battle lasted 4 months. Preston's team came at Morgan with claims about property development rights, about the potential for environmental impact if the land wasn't properly developed, about her responsibility to the local economy. It was vicious and coordinated, and exactly what Victoria had expected from her previous life. But Millbrook came to Morgan's defense. The local Farmers Association filed in support. The town council passed a resolution protecting her property from speculative development. The community that Morgan had built and that Victoria had learned to be part of stood up and said, "This farm matters." In the end, it was Victoria's work that made the actual difference. She pulled together all the data on the farm's community impact, the mental health outcomes, the educational value, the local economic benefit from the tourists who came to visit. She presented it like a legal brief, with the precision of her former self, but with the values of her current self. She made a case that wasn't about nostalgia or sentiment. She made a case about how places like this were economically and socially necessary in a world that was becoming increasingly commodified and isolated. The court sided with Morgan. Preston and his company had to back off. He sent one final email to Rachel asking her to convince Morgan to reconsider, and when that didn't work, he moved on to other projects, other small towns, other properties he could exploit. Rachel didn't call Victoria again. Victoria sent her a text saying that she hoped Rachel would one day understand why she'd made the choice she had. Rachel never responded. Victoria had thought that losing her sister would hurt more. But she realized that she'd lost her sister a long time ago, when she first chose ambition over authenticity, when she first decided that success mattered more than connection. Getting her back would have required Rachel to change fundamentally, and Rachel showed no signs of wanting to do that. Some relationships, Victoria learned, couldn't be saved, but they could be grieved, and I can't believe I organized this, Victoria said, looking at the volunteer stations and the printed materials and the signage. I, the person who cut through your fence to save 8 minutes. I'm literally organizing a charity race to slow people down and get them to pay attention. Morgan laughed. It's very on brand for your personality arc, cosmic irony and all that. The race was a 5K fundraiser that Morgan and Victoria had come up with to raise money for the Alpaca Farm's expanded mental health program. It wasn't a competitive race. In fact, Victoria had deliberately designed it to be the opposite of competitive. Runners and walkers were encouraged to go at their own pace, to notice their surroundings, to be present. There were volunteers at various points who would share facts about the local ecosystem, about small farms and sustainable living, about the alpacas themselves. The route was deliberately designed to be slightly inefficient, to take people the long way around, to make them appreciate the journey rather than just fixating on the destination. It was the anti-shortcut race. Victoria had done it on purpose. 47 people showed up. Not a huge number, but more than expected for a small-town charity event. There were locals, but there were also people from out of town, people who'd visited the farm, people who'd read about Victoria's story online, people who were hungry for something authentic. Tom's daughter, Lisa, ran the race. She'd been struggling with anxiety and had started volunteering at the farm 6 months ago. She crossed the finish line and actually looked happy, not performed happiness, real happiness. David brought his 9-year-old son, the kid he'd gotten joint custody of after his life imploded, and he'd rebuilt it. The boy was terrified at first of the alpacas, but by the end of the day, he was helping with tasks and laughing at Senator's antics. Marcus got drunk on the cider afterward and told Victoria that she'd saved his life, that the farm had saved his life, and Victoria, sobering him up with water, realized he might be right, not metaphorically, but literally. That there were paths his life could have taken that would have ended in irreversible ways if he hadn't found the farm. Rachel came to the race. Victoria almost didn't recognize her. Her sister was wearing regular clothes instead of power suits, and she looked thinner, exhausted. Preston's development company had imploded after it turned out he'd been engaged in several property fraud schemes in other towns. Rachel had caught the fallout professionally and had apparently quit to figure out what she actually wanted. She found Victoria helping at the finish line. "I drove past the farm 3 times before I actually stopped," Rachel said. "I kept thinking about what you said, about how you were happy, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I was happy, actually happy, not just successful." Victoria didn't know what to say, so she just waited. "I was wrong," Rachel continued. "About you choosing to stay here, about the farm being a waste, about settling being the same as choosing peace. I've spent the last year realizing that I've built a life that doesn't mean anything, and I don't know how to fix that." Victoria thought about that first day when Morgan had let her sit in the dirt and cleaned her hands, when she'd been willing to see potential in someone who'd actively violated her boundaries. She thought about Morgan's definition of forgiveness, not erasing what had happened, but believing someone could be better. "You could volunteer," Victoria said. "At the farm. No strings, no financial obligation, no agenda. Just come and work with the animals for a while and see if you remember how to be present." Rachel looked at her for a long moment, and Victoria saw something vulnerable in her face that she'd never seen before. "Okay," Rachel said. "I think I need that." A month later, Rachel had become a regular Saturday volunteer. She was different here, quieter, more careful, less defensive. She worked with Captain, and the old alpaca seemed to have patience with her questions and her uncertainty. Victoria watched from a distance as her sister sat with an animal that didn't care about her resume and seemed slowly to be learning how to just exist. On a Tuesday evening, Victoria was reading in the cottage she'd rented, a tiny, imperfect place with creaky floors and unreliable plumbing that she loved, when she got a text from a number she didn't recognize at first. It was from her old law firm. A woman named Susan, who'd been a junior partner there, was starting a nonprofit devoted to providing legal services for small farms. Would Victoria be interested in consulting? Victoria actually laughed out loud. The perfect circle, the perfect use of her skills applied to something that mattered. She texted back yes immediately. By the 2-year mark, the alpaca farm had expanded in ways that no development company could have improved. There were 8 volunteers regularly, a thriving educational program, and a research partnership with the university studying human-animal interaction and mental health. The farm's waiting list for volunteer positions was 3 months long. The community that Morgan had envisioned was real and thriving and genuinely making a difference. Victoria was the assistant farm manager, part-time legal consultant, and she'd become, entirely unexpectedly, kind of famous in certain circles. There were articles about the farm, about her transformation, about how a woman who'd cut through someone's fence and endangered their animals had ended up dedicating her life to protecting that same farm. She didn't post about any of it on Instagram. The farm had a professional account that Morgan handled, and it was genuinely beautiful, photos of volunteers working, students learning, animals being cared for. Victoria occasionally appeared in the background, unposed, just being part of the work. Senator died in April of his 4th year at the farm, peacefully in his sleep. Morgan cried, and Victoria cried with her, and they buried him in the back pasture with a small ceremony attended by everyone the farm had touched. Victoria gave a eulogy about what it meant to be remembered for how you treated others, about the grace of animals who could forgive human trespassing, both literal and metaphorical. Princess outlived him by 2 years, and when she finally went, Victoria and Morgan created a memorial scholarship in her name. $5,000 annually to support young people pursuing careers in farm animal care. Rachel eventually left to start her own nonprofit, one dedicated to helping corporate professionals transition to rural living and meaningful work. She still volunteered every Saturday, and while she and Victoria never quite recovered the closeness they'd had as children, they recovered something, a kind of mutual respect, a shared commitment to living differently than they'd been taught. 5 years after the day she cut through the fence, Victoria stood at the entrance to the farm for an interview. She'd finally agreed to do one, a podcast about the power of genuine apology and transformation. The interviewer, a woman named James, funny coincidence, asked her what she would say to people who were stuck in lives that didn't work for them. "I would say that the shortcut isn't always faster," Victoria replied. "Sometimes the long way around is the way that actually gets you somewhere worth going. And I would say that when you hurt someone, the way forward isn't to prove that you're better than that mistake. It's to actually change, to do the hard work of becoming someone different, and to do it not for them but for yourself because you finally understand that you deserve better than who you were. The interviewer asked if she had any regrets. Victoria thought about her 47,000 followers, now dwindled to maybe 1,500 but infinitely more real. She thought about her ex-husband, James, who'd eventually remarried and seemed genuinely happy. She thought about her career as a lawyer, which had been prestigious and completely soul-destroying. "No," she said finally. "Not about what happened, not about how I changed. The only thing I regret is not changing sooner, not realizing faster that the things I thought I wanted were making me miserable. But I can't change the past. I can only acknowledge it and move forward differently." That evening, Victoria walked through the property as the sun set, the sky turning brilliant shades of pink and orange. The alpacas were settling down for the night, moving toward their shelter with the contentment of animals who were cared for and safe. The volunteer cottage, Morgan had built 3 of them to house permanent volunteers, had lights on in 2 of them. Rachel was in one, working on nonprofit business. Lisa, the anxiety-ridden runner from the charity race, was in another, now working as the farm's full-time education coordinator. Morgan was in the barn, doing evening check on the animals one more time before bed. She was 57 now, healthy and energized in a way she'd never been in her corporate life. She'd been invited to speak at several conferences about the intersection of animal care and mental health. She'd turned them all down, saying that her work spoke for itself, that she didn't need external validation. Victoria realized that Morgan had finally reached what Victoria was still reaching toward, a genuine contentment with the life you'd actually built, rather than a constant imagining of some better version of it. "Long day?" Morgan asked as Victoria appeared in the barn. "Good day," Victoria replied. "I did the podcast interview." "How did it go?" "Honest," Victoria said. "Hard. I talked about cutting through the fence like it was both the worst thing that ever happened to me and the best thing that ever happened to me." Morgan smiled. That's exactly what it was. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the alpacas settle. Senator's grave was just visible through the barn door, a small mound marked with a stone that Lisa had painted with his name. "You know what's strange?" Victoria said. "When I cut through your fence, I was running. I was always running. And I thought the shortcut would get me somewhere faster. But the truth is, I was running in the wrong direction entirely. I needed to stop." "And now?" Morgan asked. "Now I'm walking," Victoria said. "And it's the slowest I've moved in my adult life, and it's exactly the right speed.